the example you gave earlier of the brains who had kind of the Broca's area damage, I mean, it was almost the exact finding where it's like parts of the brain are not talking to each other. And so one part of the brain clearly knows something, but the part that communicates doesn't. And it doesn't say silent, it makes something up. That's the funny thing. It's not
Yes.
as though in the absence of information, we just stay silent. It's like, no. And this is again, the implication for our lives. When we don't know something, we're not comfortable with not knowing. There's some like instinctual part of us that will fill in the blanks almost all the time. And that's what
Exactly.
now we have two different areas of research that are basically pointing to that same thing.
Yeah, the human mind and brain is a storyteller, and this is how we make sense of our world is we create these narratives.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Dharma Lab. I am Cortland Dahl. I'm here with Dr. Richard Davidson, who we all lovingly call Richie, who, as I'm sure most of you know, is one of the most pioneering and widely studied neuroscientists on the entire planet. So, a great gift to be in conversation. And today, actually, we're going to have a really cool conversation that I'm very excited about. I must say, I've known Richie for a long time. I moved to Madison, Wisconsin to study with Richie back in 2012. And I've heard many conversations at the Center for Healthy Minds, where we both work, which Richie founded, about the latest research, about cool things that are coming up in the world of neuroscience and other fields of science. But one thing that really has never happened, for those of us who work closely with Richie, is that we've never really just gotten a download from him of just all of the amazing work that has happened over the years. And one thing that you all listening may not know is that Richie, of course, has a pioneer of what we now know as contemplative science and contemplative neuroscience, which is the scientific study of how practices like meditation affect the mind, the brain, and our biology. But he also is equally a pioneer of a completely different field of neuroscience known as affective neuroscience, which you might think of as the neuroscience of emotions. So to be a pioneer of one field is kind of an incredible achievement. To be the pioneer of two fields is kind of mind-boggling. And so I've never really had the opportunity, nor many of us who work with Richie have ever had the opportunity just to say, like, we want to let's dig into some of the key insights. So I feel like this is a gift for for me as much as it is for you listening, to really just get a download of some of the most cool pioneering scientific work that has happened about the brain. So Richie, I just want to kick it over to you. I think we talked offline about this topic of neural asymmetry, and which was a huge part of your early career and this work and what I refer to as affective neuroscience. But why don't you just take us back to the beginning and some of the key insights, some of what you were working on, why you were even interested in what led to these findings, and then we can just see where the conversation goes.
Yeah. Yeah, so first, thank you everyone for tuning into Dharma Lab, and thank you, Court, for bringing this topic up. It was a topic that was near and dear to my heart. It still is a topic I'm extremely interested in, and the early part of my career was replete with investigations and a lot of thinking about this whole issue. And it really began when I was a graduate student, and I had the opportunity to study with a very, very famous neurologist at Harvard Medical School by the name of Norman Geschwind. Viewers can go look him up at some point if they're interested. He was one of the great towering figures in the specialty that we now call behavioral neurology. And I took initially a course with him that was on what he called functional neuroanatomy, which is basically how different parts of the brain are connected to different behavioral functions. And he's a neurologist. And so he would look at people and he would see their behavior as a external reflection of what was going on in the brain. That's how he looked at people. Um, and he was an extremely keen observer of behavior. And he also was very demanding. He was very much in the camp of what we would now call a localizationist. And by that, we mean someone who really believes in the specific localization of different functions in different parts of the brain. And he used to say that, if you don't believe in localization, it's because you don't know neuroanatomy well enough. Um, so he used to harangue us for, learning more neuroanatomy, which led to me doing for the first time a human brain dissection, obviously in a dead brain, but that's where I really learned neuroanatomy. But I used to go on rounds with him where he would visit patients, neurological patients in the hospital. And, he would do these bedside exams that were incredible and just clever ways of interacting with a patient to reveal what might be different about their brain. Um,
Did
uh,
they know he was doing this, or was he more it just kind of felt like a routine interaction, but he was asking them things, or was it very clear like it's an exam and he was kind of testing for different functions and so forth?
it was both. So there are times when it was explicit and times when it was implicit.
Hmm.
So, uh, the most famous implicit one is something that was not actually something that he invented, but it was developed. This simple technique was developed by um, another earlier neurologist by the name of Korsakoff, and he discovered a syndrome of dementia that was associated with alcoholism. One of the things that Korsakoff showed is that there is a separation between memory for declarative information and memory for emotional information. So I'll give an example of how this was tested. So for someone who has dementia, if I were to visit them on a day just after I visited them the day before, a normal person who has an intact brain would recognize me, right, as familiar that they saw me yesterday. Someone who has dementia, severe dementia, may not recognize me at all. So a person with dementia would not recognize me if I came back the second day after he had seen me the first day. And so what Korsakoff did is to ask whether the same was true for emotional information. And so what he did, which Geschwind also, I saw Geschwind do it with a patient. It's the first time that I saw it being done live. He'd put a thumbtack in his hand and shake the guy's hand. And, it would obviously hurt. And the guy would withdraw his hand because it was, he got pricked with a thumbtack.
I
Um,
don't think you could get away with that these days, but interesting.
right.
The stuff you could probably pull
Get
back
away
in the
with
day.
it. So, so he had done that with this patient, and he walked into the room, and he asked the patient, "Do you know who I am?" And the patient said, "No," and he said, "I'm Dr. Geschwind. I saw you yesterday." And he put his hand out to shake his hand, and the patient refused to shake his hand. Um,
Wow. Wow. That's
and,
cool.
and then he asked, "Why don't you shake my hand?" And then the patient confabulated and said, "Well, I think your hand is dirty, and I don't wanna shake your hand
This
because
is
of that."
just like the work with the corpus callosum and, the I don't know if
It
I don't even want to go take us down a rabbit hole, but very similar kind of thing, very similar kind of finding.
exactly, exactly. So,
Wow.
I
Wow.
mean, that's a beautiful demonstration that there's a complete dissociation between the declarative memory and the emotional memory. The declarative memory was gone. Patient
And
didn't.
declarative, just maybe you could unpack that term. That might be a word people are not
Declarative,
familiar
yeah,
with.
means more semantic information. It's information about, in this case, it's recognizing the person's face, recognizing their name. And, it was very clear that the patient had no memory
Hmm.
of having seen this doctor before,
No
even though
conscious memory, but
the con-
some part of their brain clearly remembered. So it's like a disconnection between your conscious experience and clearly what's going on
exactly.
unconsciously in some respect.
Exactly. And the emotional memory you can think of as a more unconscious memory. And, clearly the patient had some memory of having been pricked in his hand when he shook the hand. And so he was able to demonstrate that really dramatic dissociation.
I
Um,
mean, just that one point actually has such huge implications for kind of our life and points to something that probably happens a lot where we have an interpretation of something that we're completely convinced of. And it seems so real. It just seems like this is what's happening to the degree that it doesn't even occur to us that it's even interpretation. And yet it's a complete, as you were saying, confabulation. It's basically the mind has limited information or it's not conscious of something and it's created a whole story about something, but it's
exactly.
totally disconnected. It's like actually not connected at all. In some cases, just flat out wrong. But yet in the moment, it feels like reality. It feels like it's just a perception of what's happening.
Exactly. And this, as you said before, Court, which is so incredibly true, is that this is not just occurring in patients with frank damage to their brain. This is happening in all of us all the time. And this is the way our minds work. It creates a story about the world. And it's from that story that we operate. It's not from some you know, veridical perception of things in the world. There's no such thing as that. Our minds are constantly creating these stories. And of course, this very directly relates particularly to our insight pillar of well being, which is really about the narrative that we're constantly creating about ourselves. So, getting back to Geschwind, one of his great contributions as a neurologist is the discovery of language related lateralization in the human brain. And so, what that means is in virtually all right handed people, and I'll talk about left handed people in a moment, but in virtually all right handed people, which accounts for around 85 to 90% of the population, in virtually all of those people, it is the left hemisphere that can speak, but the right hemisphere can't. And what we mean by that is quite literally that the speech related centers in the brain, and there's a key region in the brain called Broca's area, and it was named after this neurologist named Paul Broca. And it is an area in the left hemisphere, in the left temporal lobe, and damage to that area, which occurs in certain kinds of stroke, will impair a person's ability to speak. Now, what's, super interesting, I mean, there are many things that are interesting about this, but this is one of the most clearly lateralized functions in the human brain. And what we mean by that is that if a patient has damage to this area in their left hemisphere, the corresponding area in the right hemisphere doesn't immediately take over. And so the person actually will show impairments in their ability to speak. And stroke patients who have damage to that area of the brain will be impaired in their productive language. They won't be able to speak. So that was, one of the very, very early observations. This began a whole cottage industry of research to uh, investigate the extent to which other kinds of functions are also lateralized. And it led to this view that while there's a lot of redundancy between the two hemispheres of the brain, I should say, I should start off by saying that humans have two halves of their brain, and it's pretty much a replica on each side of the other side, with some important differences. But at a gross level, the left and the right hemisphere are very, very similar. And they're connected by this massive fiber bundle that we call the corpus callosum that you alluded to earlier, which is a massive bundle of white matter. And these are the connections that go between neurons in one hemisphere and corresponding neurons in the other hemisphere. And this is the largest pathway of connection that exists in the human brain. Um, the connection between the two hemispheres of the brain. One of the things you alluded to earlier, Court, that I'll just make explicit is that there was a time, it's hardly done anymore, but there was a time when it was done much more, is patients who have epilepsy that is restricted to one hemisphere of the brain, let's say they have an epileptic focus in their left hemisphere, what happens is because of the corpus callosum, because of these connections between one hemisphere and the other, the electrical discharges that were initiated in the left hemisphere would spread to the right hemisphere and would result in a much more massive seizure. And if somehow the seizure can be just restricted to one hemisphere, it would dramatically reduce the symptoms. And this is what was found. And what was done is patients actually went through neurosurgery where they had the corpus callosum cut, severed, 200 million neurons just cut. And those connections for the most part, don't grow back, at least, in the time span that people have, because this is typically done in adults. Um, and over that course of time is not enough time for the connections to regenerate in any way. And that leaves a person with two hemispheres that are disconnected. And when you have two hemispheres that are disconnected, you can demonstrate some weird dissociations because normally the hemispheres talk to each other. So normally information in one hemisphere is accessible to the other hemisphere and vice versa. And it's one of the reasons why I can pick up a glass with my left hand and I can say what it is I'm holding, even if I'm blindfolded, just by the feel of it. I'd be able to say, now, this, if I'm picking it up with my left hand, the left hand projects to the right hemisphere. And we know that that's how the pathways work. And so the only way I can verbally identify this is if information goes from the right hemisphere to my left hemisphere. And in a patient who has a split brain, if they're holding a glass and they're blindfolded, they would not be able to say what it is they're holding. But if you gave them a multiple choice with pictures, they'd be able to pick it out easily, but they wouldn't be able to verbalize it.
So it
Um,
just, I mean, it reminds me, I mean, that work, I mean, Gazzaniga's work shows the example you gave earlier of the brains who had kind of the Broca's area damage. I mean, it was almost the exact finding where so like the brain, parts of the brain are not talking to each other. And so one part of the brain clearly knows something, but the part that communicates doesn't. And it doesn't say silent, it makes something up. That's the funny thing. It's not
yes,
as though in the absence of information, we just stay silent. It's like, no. And this is again, the implication for our lives. When we don't know something, we're not comfortable with not knowing. There's some like instinctual part of us that will fill in the blanks almost all the time. And that's what,
exactly.
now we have two different areas of research that are basically pointing to that same thing.
Yeah, the human mind and brain is a storyteller, and this is how we make sense of our world is we create these narratives. So just going back to this idea of asymmetry, most of the research when I first began this work was focused on the back of the brain. And this is where, or the mid part and the back, and this is where language differences resided. And it was also where some perceptual differences resided. So we know the left hemisphere is specialized for speaking and language, and the right hemisphere seems to be in the back, a little bit better with certain kinds of visual spatial skills
Mm.
and using some visual spatial kinds of tasks that really require your visualization of something and solving a problem through visualization. We know from various kinds of experiments with people with brain damage, with split brain patients, and with normal patients, normal individuals using some clever behavioral methods that the right hemisphere is better at certain of those tasks. So, one of the other amazing observations that was very early on in this time is that when patients had damage to their left hemisphere, and the damage was including the prefrontal region of the left hemisphere, they were much more likely to exhibit depression as
Mhm.
one of the outcomes or one of the consequences of the brain damage. And so two people who were normal before they had brain damage, and this is often brain damage from stroke, after the brain damage, one was much more likely to be depressed. The other person had comparable amounts of damage, but in a different part of the brain, and they were less likely to be depressed in this way.
And this was
And
true even if it was the exact same regions, but on the in the right hemisphere?
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And so this led to the conjecture, well, maybe the left hemisphere is playing some role in certain kinds of emotions which are antithetical to depression. And one of the things that seemed to be the case is that these patients seem to be anhedonic. They're not
Yeah.
experiencing very much pleasure. And that's the kind of depression that they're exhibiting. There are also clinical reports of patients with damage to their right hemisphere whose left hemispheres was intact, showing kind of inappropriate laughter and joy in weird situations where it wouldn't be normative
Mm.
to do that. And so that was just some very early clues that there may be some interesting emotional differences
Were
between.
there just a quick, question. Was there any clarity about I mean, there's kinda 2 different things when you think about positive emotions. One is the occurrence of the emotions in the first place, and a second factor is your ability to sustain them and savor them, so to speak. Was there any clarity about whether it's one or the other or both of those?
No. So, these were really early clinical impressions, and these were all studies published in journals that are journals of neurology, where they're often, take essentially like 8 cases of individuals with one kind of brain damage and compare them to 8 cases with another kind of brain damage. And they're sort of clinical descriptions. Very little objective testing. So, but this was, for some reason, really got interested in this. Became interested in emotion because it was so understudied. And, in those days, all the research on the brain and emotion, almost 100% of it was done in rats. It was really kind of primitive emotion related work, and it all focused on primarily the hypothalamus, which is very important for kind of basic drives like hunger, sex, and the hypothalamus plays an important role in regulating these basic drives that are clearly related to emotion, but it's also clearly not the whole story. So it interested me that they were seeing these emotional reactions from people that had cortical damage that didn't involve any subcortical regions whatsoever. And that was verified with MRI scans in these patients. Now, it could be sort of downstream functional changes in these subcortical structures. There probably was some of that, but there wasn't any frank damage to these subcortical structures. So that's what was really what got us interested in this. And then, I began to think about ways of framing this that are theoretically meaningful. And one of the things, there are a few things about asymmetry that is important to know. One is that asymmetries are not restricted to humans. You see asymmetries at in other species. However, given that language is pretty much, with some exceptions for certain kinds of communication, but nothing nearly as sophisticated as human language. I mean, every scientist would agree that there's no species whose communication system remotely resembles the
Mm.
sophistication of human language. There may be primitive kinds of communication, and we know in birds, there's the bird song is a mechanism of communication among birds, and there are sounds that other animals emit that are used functionally for communicative purposes. But again, there's nothing, remotely as sophisticated as human language. And so the fact that there were asymmetries in other species suggested that maybe the asymmetries are not fundamentally tied to language, but they
Mm.
may be tied to other, even more basic mechanisms, and language may be a component of those, but may not be the kind of evolutionary driver, if you will. And so we were searching for what may be, an important evolutionary driver of this. And there's a very famous and very obscure paper. I mean, it sounds strange for it to be famous and obscure at the same time, but I think it's, both of those terms are apt. It was published by
It's like a cult
etholo
classic of science or something.
yes, exactly. It was published by an ethologist by the name of Schneerler,
I don't
Schne.
even know what an ethologist is. What's an ethologist?
An ethologist studies the behavior of animals in their natural environments.
Okay. Hopefully, I'm not
Yes.
the only one who doesn't know what an ethologist is, but
Yeah, and I believe that at the time that this paper appeared, Schneeler was working, and this is a place where a lot of very famous ethologists worked in their time, at the Museum of Natural History in New York City.
Mm.
And I'm a kid who was born in New York City, and I used to spend weekends, holing myself up in the Museum of Natural History in Manhattan.
Great.
This was my nerdy.
We should dig up some pictures of you, and that'd be great to see.
I loved this, museum. It was really a special place for me, and, and there was a whole research wing associated with it. I don't think that it's there anymore, but, Margaret Mead, the very famous anthropologist, worked at the Museum of Natural History. Gregory Bateson worked at the Museum of
Mhm.
Natural History. So some really famous people went through the Museum of Natural History in New York. It was an iconic place for some period of time. So there was this paper published in 1959 in a very obscure place called the Nebraska Symposium on Motivation. And the title of the paper was something like Approach Withdrawal Throughout Phylogeny. That's not the
Mm.
exact title, but it's something like the title. And what it did is it traced approach and avoidance or approach and withdrawal behavior at every level of phylogeny, even in single cell organisms. So one of the claims that Schneeler makes is that if an organism behaves, if it shows any behavior, it will approach and withdraw.
Mm.
That's the fundamental psychological decision, if you will, that an organism makes with respect to its environment. It will
This was
approach
just framing it as like the most basic thing about life
itself.
generally.
Yes, exactly.
Hmm, hmm.
Exactly.
I could
And,
see why that would be a cult classic, and the Nebraska like that. I could see now why you say that. I could see why both those things are definitely true.
so in kind of a moment of loose but really creative insight, it occurred to me that asymmetry is a fundamental property of nervous systems.
Mm.
Approach and withdrawal is a fundamental psychological decision, if you will, behavioral decision that organisms make. Maybe these are connected. And maybe those observations in brain damaged patients about depression and euphoria maybe they have something to do with this.
Actually,
Um,
it just as a very quick footnote, it's so interesting because in there's nothing like this sophistication of the understanding of human biology that you find, for example, in Tibetan Buddhism. But what you do have is a corresponding, incredibly sophisticated understanding of the mind and psychology and what they call the subtle body. And there an asymmetry is all over the place in the subtle body. I mean, there's all sorts of mappings to like the left and right kind of the movement of energy, especially, and even the terms approach and avoidance are not used, but attachment and aversion are used, and those you could very much see as kind of like the
abs-
corollaries. I mean,
abs-
it's like this same mapping, but onto like this anatomy of the subtle energetic body. For so, anyways, just to say that there's almost a perfect correlation
yeah,
in what you're saying.
I love that, and yeah, I've thought about that too, and there are breathing practices that we do. There's unilateral uninostril breathing
Yeah.
that may differentially activate each hemisphere, and there's actual research that's been done on that. That may be for another time, but all of this is to say that this was really the beginning of a framing of a theory of brain asymmetry and its relation to these fundamental dimensions of approach and withdrawal, or we can say perhaps attachment and aversion. Um,
And are you
uh,
just to locate this in time? Is this like late '70s that you're now? Is this happening? When
yes,
exactly is this? Mid to late
yes,
'70s?
it's the late 1970s. Yeah. And for a variety of reasons, I thought that if more specifically, these asymmetries might be located in the prefrontal region. And there was another really iconic figure who played an important role in my very early shaping of my thinking, who is one of the greatest neuroanatomists of the 20th century. His name was Wally Nauta, Nauta. There are stains that have been named after him, stains of brain cells. He was at MIT at the time. I was a graduate student at Harvard, and we were Harvard and MIT students are allowed to take courses in each other's places. And everyone, Geschwind told me, I really need to take Wally Nauta's neuroanatomy class. That's where I did the human brain dissection. Wally Nauta, he was an extraordinary neuroanatomist, but his specific area of focus was the neuroanatomy of the prefrontal cortex. And he published another one of these famous and obscure papers, and the title of it was the frontal lobes a reinterpretation, and it was published in a journal called the Journal of Psychiatric Research, which is really not a high profile paper, but I don't know how many citations that paper has. I suspect it has a lot, but it's a paper where for the first time I ever read anyone speculating that the prefrontal cortex actually has something to do with emotion,
Hmm.
not just with cognitive function. Historically, the prefrontal cortex was part of the cognitive machinery of the brain, but not a
Could we just do? I think we can do a whole episode just on what you mentioned, and we should do an episode on that. But could you
yeah,
just
there's
do a
a
little detour, just really quickly, about why? Basically, there's really important historical reasons why that happened, and it's had such massive implications to this day, even to how we talk about the mind and experience, and maybe just a little quick detour, and then we can put a pin in it for like a whole episode
yeah,
later.
yeah, definitely. So the just to put the pin in it, this is really a byproduct of a philosophical dogma that thought and feeling were separated in the mind and the brain. That there's rational thought on the one hand, and there's emotion and feeling on the other hand, and the two really are independent.
And often at war with each other in kind of the
Wa-
popular imagination.
Yes, at war with each other. Yeah, yeah, um,
So
yeah.
that
In
what you just
fact,
said about the brain, like to map that onto the brain, like that was probably a controversial I would assume that was not part of the normal conception of the prefrontal cortex because that was a quote unquote like rational part of the brain. So to
Yeah,
think of it as involved with emotion kind of goes against that
yeah.
orthodoxy.
And I should just mention that there's a psychologist by the name of Herbert Simon, who worked at Carnegie Mellon University, who actually received a Nobel Prize in economics because he did work on decision making that was relevant to economics. He's one of two psychologists, I believe, to receive the Nobel Prize in economics. The second one was Daniel Kahneman. Herb Simon received the Nobel Prize earlier, but Herb Simon lived in the era where the metaphor for the human mind was the computer, and it was all about rule-based rational thinking in those days. And I will never forget reading this piece by Herb Simon where he basically talked about emotion as the thing in the mind that interferes with rationality and is to be banished. And, and he was enamored with computers because computers don't have feelings. And so they're the best model for pure rationality because they're unperturbed by feelings. It just struck me that, for someone who's clearly very smart, this wasn't a particularly um, wise, shall we say, viewpoint, given you know, the the intuition conjecture I had about the role of emotion. Um, I mean, there's so
Is
many.
it safe to say that neuroscientists at the time probably intuitively all believed that there were just separate regions or networks for emotion and separate for cognition and just never the twain shall meet kind of thinking?
Well,
Was
the
that
twains met, but only competitively.
but they're different. I mean, clearly they
Yes,
need to,
totally
or it
different.
was like one exerting control on the other and
Yeah, and they were antagonistic in some way.
yeah.
The idea that they can be working synergistically together was just, not at all in the lexicon or the imagination of these scientists in those days.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, maybe this podcast will be part one of a multi-part series because I know we're going to have to end soon. But let me just, in the few minutes we have remaining, say a few more things, getting back to asymmetry and approach and withdrawal and how we began to look at this. So, in the days when we began, the only way we had to interrogate the human brain non-invasively was with EEG, with brain electrical activity, where we put electrodes on the scalp surface and we try to make inferences about what's going on in the brain from this electrical activity. This is a method that is completely safe, it's totally non-invasive, and it's been around for a while, and there have been very significant developments in the precision with which we're able to do this with this sort of thing. So we began a series of studies where we were recording the electrical activity of the brain in these prefrontal regions, and we were trying to activate emotions in people that were associated with what we thought of as approach, where they'd have the disposition to move toward something, be attracted to something.
So
Uh,
liking, wanting, like
yeah,
motivational behavior. Well, I guess motivational could be an avoidance motivation, but like
right. Or
trying
the
to get
opposite.
something or yeah,
Right, or the opposite.
yeah.
And one of the ways we did this is, we thought that if this is really fundamental, it should be present very early on in life. And so we did a series of studies in babies, including in newborn infants. And so you might ask, well, what do you do with a newborn infant to elicit, these kind of emotional behaviors? And it's actually pretty easy in newborn infants. So what we did in newborn infants is we gave them a little squirt of sugar water, which they loved, and we gave them a squirt of basically lemon juice.
Yeah, you can just imagine the faces all squishing
And
up and
we recorded their facial expression. So
yeah.
we had it on video, and, we got the insight to do that was because Darwin Charles Darwin wrote a book in 1865 called The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals, and he made the claim in that book based on, very limited sort of casual observation that these facial expressions of pleasure and disgust were innate and they were
Right.
present from birth. And so we tried this, and, sure enough, you can easily elicit these different in almost every single infant, giving them a little spritz of sugar water versus lemon juice, you see very clearly different facial responses. This is, 72 hours after birth.
Amazing. Wow.
And we were recording the brain electrical activity. And we see differences in asymmetries, in the way that we predicted in.
Were there any individual differences in the asymmetry, or is it pretty much just baked into the structure and is
No,
it
they're big
universal?
they're big individual differences, big,
Okay.
and that turned out to be a very fruitful area of exploration, which we can talk about at another time. But for the purposes now, it's, to just say that people differ in their asymmetry at baseline before you
Right.
do anything. And people who have greater left-sided prefrontal activation tend to be people who we think of as more approach-oriented people. They're people who tend to be more optimistic, and who have this quality of what we would say is more behavioral activation. They're sort of ready to go when the opportunity presents itself. And people who had more activation in the same regions in the right hemisphere, on average, were more avoidant, and they tend to be more shy, for example.
I mean, you can imagine studying this in rats and animals. You'd like ones that are kind of in the corner of the cage versus the ones that are running around and exploring everything. Probably very
Y-
easy to measure that.
Exactly, exactly. So, I mean, we didn't do that. The work that we did was with in humans, but it was easy to see these things early on in life, with these simple kinds of stimuli that we can safely present to newborn infants or babies within the first year of life. Yeah.
I wonder, I mean, I think there's like 10 more discussions that are going to spin off from this one. I wonder if just to end here, just this current chapter of what I think will hopefully become a whole book. What do you think are the kind of the take home messages aside from just it's kind of interesting to learn about the brain, but you were also a meditator at this time. I imagine you were learning things about your own mind and your life and insights that actually helped you or were interesting. Are there what for you are kind of the key take homes for like actually this is helpful for us to know this so
Yeah.
that we can
Yeah.
navigate our own inner train more effectively?
Yeah, so there are lots of things to share, but let me just focus on one that led to a very concrete project that culminated in an important publication, not necessarily my best scientific publication, but it is the most highly cited scientific publication that I have. And it was a paper that was published in 2003, um, to the best of our knowledge, it is the first randomized controlled trial of mindfulness-based stress reduction that had ever been done. Mindfulness-based stress reduction was developed by John Kabat-Zinn. We had John Kabat-Zinn on an earlier episode of Dharma Lab, and John developed this as an 8-week intervention to give people some initial training in basic awareness practices, primarily. One of the things that was convenient about mindfulness-based stress reduction is that it's taught at virtually every academic medical center, and so it's very commonly available. And so we studied MBSR, as it's known, in a group of very stressed employees at a tech company in Madison, Wisconsin, and what we did is we brought them into the lab before and after they went through this 8-week program, and one of the things that we measured is the asymmetry in their brain.
Hmm.
And we measured this because we thought, wow, if people are more kind of optimistic and have this more approach orientation, maybe in these beginning meditators, there would be a shift toward more left sided activation with this training. And we also happened in this particular study the study started in the beginning of September. And remember, it was an 8-week intervention. So the intervention finished right around Thanksgiving time. And in the US, around this time in November is a time when people traditionally get flu shots if they're going to get a flu shot and a flu vaccine. And we told people before the study that they shouldn't get a flu vaccine. We're going to give them a flu vaccine ourselves at the end of the study, which is the normal time you would get such a vaccine. But we would do it a little differently than if they were getting the vaccine in a pharmacy or from their local doctor, because we take blood samples before and after the vaccine, which allows us to quantitatively determine the magnitude of antibody titers to the vaccine, which basically tells us how effective the vaccine is working. And we hypothesize that maybe people who go through this meditation training would show a more robust response to the vaccine. So, what we found in this study is that yes, people did show a greater increase in left sided activation over the course of training. And they also showed a more robust response to the flu vaccine compared to untreated controls. So these were really novel findings at the time they were reported in 2003, which is the primary reason why this paper has such high citations, not because it's a particularly great paper in terms of its methodology. It's limited. We didn't have that many participants, and there are limitations to what we did. It was just the first study of its kind. And there's a lot to say, though, about asymmetry. And let me just conclude with a kind of puzzle, and just to give you a sense for why this work really hasn't continued, why we're not continuing to do this work to any significant degree. We measured the brain electrical activity of very long-term practitioners who have been meditating, for decades and who have tens of thousands of hours of practice, and they don't show extreme left prefrontal activation. And so it's not so simple. And this began to raise all kinds of questions for us about what this metric is actually reflecting. It's clearly reflecting something. It's reflecting something interesting. It seems to be associated with these early stages of meditation practice. But just as with other kinds of measures, there may be a kind of inverted U-shaped function, and it's clearly much more complicated than we originally thought. Also, we thought about this a lot in terms of approach and withdrawal and positive and negative emotion. And one of the things that a deeper reflection in Buddhist psychology leads us to believe is that maybe the way we're parsing the emotion domain is very imperfect, and there may be better ways of parsing this. One dimension, which comes more from the Buddhist framework, that may be really a better way of thinking about this, is emotions that may be virtuous or unvirtuous. That is, emotions that lead us toward increased kind of awareness and connection and insight and purpose, or emotions that may detract from that. And so this gives it much more nuance and complexity. And it became clear to us that it was necessary to take this complexity into account. And so it's led to a much richer and more elaborated kind of framework.
Wow. Well, I think we just mapped out like 10 future Dharma Lab episodes. This is fantastic. Thank you so much, Richie. I must say, for everybody listening, I've been wanting to do this for so long, just kind of geek out on some of these questions and these lines of research because they're just so fascinating. There's so many implications. Actually, I still have so many more questions now than I began with. I especially want to go to the 1990s when asymmetry kind of caught the popular imagination. Remember, there was like books
Yeah.
like writing
Yeah.
from the left side of there's all this like left brain, right brain thing. I would love to just hear like because having been like one of the pioneers of that whole field, and then it suddenly caught fire in probably a way that I would guess was misrepresenting and oversimplifying things. But anyways, that's a whole nother episode. There's many little rabbit holes we could go down. So I just want to thank you, Richie. This was fantastic. I look forward to many future conversations. And for everybody listening, thank you for tuning in. And I can promise that this will not be the last conversation that we have here of this kind. So take care and see you soon.
Thank you.